But here, and there actually, as they're thinking about the same thing, we are continuing to think about the covenants that God entered into with people. And this week we see another significant change as we think about the covenant given at the time of Moses. Just to recap, the first one, the one given to Noah, affected every single person on the planet. God said, I will never send another flood to destroy every living thing. It was a covenant given to Noah, to an individual, but it affected everybody. And the second, made with Abraham, was initially just for him and for his family, even though it was to extend to his descendants and would have an impact on many others. This one, the one we're thinking about today, was between God and a nation. We're not sure exactly how many people. The story talks about 600,000 plus a few hangers-on. So it was quite a group of people. But this was a nation that was just starting to form. People who were just starting to realize that is what they were. They were in a new situation. They'd spent the previous 400 years in Egypt. Many of that time as slaves, with no sense of freedom or any idea that they could function as an independent nation. And suddenly, that was who they were. And they had to work out what that looked like. And as Clarissa was sharing this morning, I was thinking, that message from God that Clarissa was sharing for us would have been exactly what these people needed to hear. That they were suddenly in a situation where they were in the middle of this wilderness, and they were on this journey to this place that God had promised them hundreds of years before. And there was a lot of things they didn't know. How to get there, what to do with people they met when they got there, how to look after themselves, how to have enough to eat and to drink. And they needed to know that God was with them in this new and challenging situation. And as in all the covenants we've seen so far, there's a common thread. They start with people having a relationship with God. And that leads them to having a clear identity because of that relationship. In this group of 600,000+ people, there would have been many, many different ideas and thoughts and concepts, but they were united because they were the people of God. They'd been chosen. In the reading that Peter read, it talked about being chosen, a special people, a chosen possession. And then from that place of relationship and identity, these covenants encourage us to think about how God's people respond in obedience to what God is calling them to do. That's a common thread. And for Moses, he recognized that something special was going on. He recognized that what God had done was unique. And it gave these people a particular standing. He reflects on this in the book of Deuteronomy, where he asks this question, a sort of rhetorical question, where he doesn't need an answer. He knows what the answer is. Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation, by testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? What is Moses reminding the people of? That God had chosen them, that God had rescued them, that God was going to lead them into a wonderful land, that God was going to provide for them, that God was going to give them clear laws and guidance to live by. So it's something special, something unique. And what we see here in these passages that Peter read is that as God does these things, he was going to enter into a covenant relationship with them. Not in isolation. This wasn't a new idea that God had just dreamed up. But because of the covenant he had established with Abraham hundreds of years before. In Exodus 6, God makes this clear. I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I've remembered my covenant. While the people were still in slavery, God heard and remembered the covenant he had with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And normally, when we read about God remembering something, it's not that he'd forgotten and suddenly he remembers it again, because God doesn't forget things. It's about God choosing to do something, to act in response to what is going on. And so he rescued the people to fulfill that covenant that he had with their ancestors. And now he's going to establish a covenant directly with this new nation. And one of the interesting things I think we see in this account is that God does this in stages. In 19 verse 4 to 6, in the first passage that Peter read, God reminds the people of what he has done for them and speaks about the blessings that the people will receive if they keep to their obligations under this covenant. In the next few chapters, Exodus 20 to 23, God lays out what is expected of them, how they are to behave as his covenant people. Effectively, if you sign up to this, this is what I expect of you. And then in the second passage that Peter read, in 24, 1 to 8, the covenant is actually put in place. It's established based on the people's commitments that they would do everything God had said, that they would obey it all. So let's just look at that first part of that journey. You've seen what I did to Egypt. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. God reminds the people of what had just happened, that he had demonstrated his power and supremacy over the Egyptian rulers and army, a major power in the world at that time. He reminds them that he'd carried them out of Egypt, not just to end up in the desert, but to enter into a relationship with him. And now he was offering to commit himself in an exclusive way to this group of people. People could have looked at those people wandering in the desert and thought, what on earth do they think they're about? What value can they have? How can they ever think that they'll amount to anything when there are all these other nations around that are well established? And God could have chosen to engage with any nation, but he offers it to them, that they will become a kingdom. They will become the people who show everyone else what God is like. They will be the people who can represent others to God. There will be a nation set apart for this God and separate from all the other nations in the world. There was nothing in them to merit God's choice. As Tim reminded us at the beginning of our time together, there is nothing in us that merits God's favor upon us. But he chooses to work with broken and damaged and hurting people. And this is what God was doing here with this nation. These people who had been set free, these people who would be blessed and could be a blessing to everyone else. Just as we are and just as we can be. And one of the wonderful things about this passage that Peter read is that even before hearing in detail what was going to be expected of them, the people make a unanimous response in verse 8. We will do everything the Lord has said. You know, if somebody comes to you and says, I need you to sign this contract. I actually got some paperwork to sign this week for something that we're looking at. And there was so much that came through the post that I weighed it before I opened it. And I was just fascinated to see how much paper there was. It weighed 1 pound and 9 ounces. That's a lot of paper. And I was expected to sign this thing. And I will admit that I did not read every word. But I think I got the gist. And you know, we're encouraged to read all the paperwork before we sign anything important, because we're not sure what people are asking of us. And we want to make sure we're not being tricked into anything, which is so important at the moment. So much money is lost to fraud, that's a different story. But the people, at this moment, before they knew what God was asking of them, they said, yeah, we'll do it. And they could do that in confidence because they recognized what God had done for them. He'd revealed himself to them. He'd rescued them. He'd brought them out of their terrible situation. He'd promised that he would continue to bless them, and that was enough. And so they were prepared to fully sign up for what God was offering them. A response of trust, a response of confidence in that God. And then, the intervening bits that we didn't read this morning, at the beginning of chapter 20, just before he starts to tell them what's expected of them, if they sign up to this covenant, God reminds them of who he is. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. This is who I am. And because of that relationship, I want you to live in a certain way. Because I am who I am, because I have done what I have done, this is what I'm asking of you as my people. And the people have said that they will do this. And so on the basis of that, on the basis of his relationship, God starts to lay out what he expects of them. First, the giving of the 10 Commandments, with those broad, sweeping ideas about what it means to live in relationship with God and in community. And that's followed by a range of other laws and principles for living. It's a fascinating range of things, the sort of altars they should build, how they should worship, the provision for good treatment of servants, how to respond when someone injures someone else, how to protect property, how to protect the community, particularly the vulnerable, how to ensure justice within the community, the importance of Sabbath, opportunities to recognize and celebrate God's goodness. That's the sort of scope of what God is saying. This is how you should live. And after hearing that and reflecting on it, we get to a point where they're ready to sign up. And there's in chapter 24, those verses that we read, there's a sort of another three-stage process. Moses takes some of the blood that had been sacrificed and he puts it on the altar. Then he reads the law to the people and says, this is what you're being asked to sign up to. And they again say yes. Then he takes the rest of the blood and sprinkles it on the people. So they're actually coming to that moment of choice. As we've seen before, these covenant commitments often involve the use of blood, with an animal being killed, a sacrifice being made, as an indication of how seriously those involved were taking the commitments that they were making. And so Moses takes this blood, as I say, and he splashes it on the altar, although we don't actually know what that word means. Different translators have had different goes at this, and we have sprinkled and splashed and threw and dashed and splattered are all words that people have come up with to try and explain what Moses did. But it's the symbolism that's important. The altar is that place of worship to God. And so this first act symbolizes that God is committed to this covenant. And after reading the laws and the commands to the people, and they respond by committing to be obedient, Moses in turn sprinkles the blood on them. So the two parties in this agreement are connected together through the blood of this sacrifice. Just as in our relationship with God, we are connected together through the sacrifice that Jesus made for us on the cross. And so for these people, it was done, it was agreed, God and this group of people were in covenant relationship together. They did not have to keep these laws in order to become part of the community of God's people. It was that as that community, they had agreed to live in the way that God asked of them. And I just want to go back to that process, that three-stage process, where God says, I want you to think about signing up to something. And then God lays out what is expected of them if they do. And then they get to that point of commitment. Because I wonder whether some of us here this morning may be in a similar process. Maybe God is speaking to you as an individual. Maybe God is speaking to us as a church about something he wants you to do, some commitment he wants you to make, and saying, if you are prepared to do this, these are the blessings that will follow. Or maybe you're in the stage where God is making clear to you exactly what it will mean, what it might cost, what changes in lifestyle and behavior it might result in, if you say yes. Or maybe you've come to that that third stage in the process, that point of decision, where you have total clarity about what God is asking of you and what the implications of that are. And you need to decide whether it's something you are willing and prepared to do. Wonder if anybody's on that journey this morning. When I started thinking about going into full-time church ministry, I don't know, must be 15 years ago, it started with a sense of being unsettled in what I was currently doing. A sense that God was speaking to me about maybe it's time to do something else. And that developed into the idea that God might be calling me to take on this new role, this different way of spending my time. And that was followed by quite a long process of working out with God, with Joe and our boys, with my current church at the time and others, what that would mean. Although not all the questions were answered. But then we came to a point of decision as to whether it was the right thing to do. Some years later, when I started exploring the option of moving here to take on my current role, it started with seeing the opportunity and getting excited about that prospect. It developed over a period of time and working with others to get a fuller sense of what it would involve. And then it came to a point of decision for the church family and for Joe and for me. God often works in this way. He takes us through a journey, calling us to something, explaining what he wants of us, and then bringing us to a place of decision. I believe that as a church, God is calling us to a greater focus on discipleship, to get to a point where we are each seeking to live each day as a fully committed follower of Jesus and seeking opportunities to introduce others to him as well. And we're going through a period of time to try to work out what that means and how that actually gets worked out in practice. And then for each of us, there's a question as to whether this is something we are willing to sign up to. This morning, is there something God is asking of you? And if so, how are you going to respond to this God that we've been singing about, this God we've been praising, this God we've been reflecting on this morning? In the time of Moses, we know what they did. They said, yes, we will do this. We will sign up to this. And they committed to that covenant relationship. But that's not where the story ends. There was another covenant ahead of them. In Exodus 34, verse 10, the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. You might look at this and think, well, why? We've already got one. Why do we need another one? Just a short while later. And they needed it because something had gone badly, badly wrong. The people had turned away from God. They'd given up on God. They'd made a golden idol of a calf. When Moses heard about this, he was coming down from a mountain. He had 2 tablets of stone with him. God had written the laws of the covenant on those tablets. And when Moses saw what was going on, he threw them to the ground and they broke into pieces, symbolizing the reality that the people had failed to live up to their commitments, and so the covenant had effectively been broken. God acted in punishment. 3,000 of the people were killed. And God had got to the point where he was saying that he was no longer going to go with them, as he might destroy them on the journey if they continued to disobey him. And this understandably caused a lot of distress among the people. They did not want to lose that privileged relationship with God. Moses pleaded with God to continue the journey, as he recognized that without God's presence, they would be just like any other nation on earth. That's the first song that Tim started our service with. Reminds us of the reality that it is only with God that we can make a difference. And God agreed to Moses' request. And so God reinstates this covenant that had been broken, recommitting himself again to these people, even though they had not been obedient to what he had asked of them. God was gracious. God was merciful. God was forgiving. and re-established that covenant. But even that isn't the end of God establishing a covenant through Moses. Deuteronomy 29, 40 years later. These are the terms of the covenant the Lord commanded to make with the Israelites in Moab, in addition to the covenant he'd made with them at Horeb. Much of the book of Deuteronomy, which is a fascinating book, is either Moses reminding the people of some of the key points in their lives as they'd wandered through the wilderness for many years, or a range of laws and commands focused on how the people should live into the land that they were just going to move into and occupy. And here, towards the end of the book, we see what this means. A new covenant is needed to add to the one made 40 years earlier. Why? Well, they were just about to go into a totally new and different situation. And so the laws that had guided them on their desert journey were not sufficient for what they would face as they started to occupy land and build houses and settle down. They were no longer going to be wandering nomads. They would be establishing themselves as a settled population of people. Many of the principles that God had laid down were still the same, but they needed to be applied differently into a new situation. And we experience this many times in our lives. We may know the basic rules for driving a car on a road, but they need to be applied differently when we drive in a country where we drive on the right. The thing that gets me all the time is roundabouts. I really struggle with roundabouts when I'm driving on the wrong side, on the other side of the road. We may know the rules of tennis, a bit topical at the moment, but the application of those principles vary on different surfaces. We may know how to play the piano. Playing an organ requires those principles and skills to be applied differently, and so on. God was continuing to engage with his people, to be with his people, as they entered into this different chapter in their lives, and he was trying to prepare and equip them for what they would mean. So 3 times God established the covenant with the people through Moses for different reasons. One, to set things up as they started this new journey, this new chapter in their lives. One, to fix something that had been broken. And the last, that wasn't a response to something they'd done wrong, but a response to a new situation, a new context. So what does this mean for us here this morning? We do not live under the Mosaic covenant. We are not physical descendants of those whom God rescued from Egypt, although Jesus has rescued us from the bondage of slavery and sin. We are not ethnic Israelites, well, at least most of us, although we have been brought into God's family through Jesus. We were not promised the land of Palestine, although we have been promised a wonderful inheritance as co-heirs with Christ. But the principles that God outlined in those covenants are still very relevant for us as God's people. The call to be dedicated to him, the call to be holy, the call to be obedient, the call to live as a godly example to others, the call to bring others to God as priests. These all very much still apply. And we need to be continually thinking and reflecting and praying on what that means in the situation in which we live in Crewe in 2022. Because applying those principles today may require something very different than what they required 10 years ago, 1 year ago, or even last month. So what does it mean to us? What does it mean to you? Well, here are 3 questions to think about and reflect on. What are you going to take away from this reflection on the covenant arrangement that God had with his people in the time of Moses? We just thought about something of what that meant. What are you going to take away from that account? And then what difference is that takeaway going to make to you this week? And then a simple question. Hard question. If God is asking something of you, are you going to say yes? We might not know what the outcome of saying yes is, but we say yes to a God who loves us, a God who cares for us, a God who's rescued us, a God who wants the best for us. I'm going to leave you to think about those questions for a few minutes, and then Tim is going to come and draw our time to a close.